Okay. I think I'm going to take this opportunity of silence to start the panel. Thank you all for joining us. I'm wearing my name tag a little weird, but I'm Lujain. I'm a PhD student here at the Oxford Internet Institute that studies social data science. And I'm really excited to be here with our panelists to moderate this panel on industry use cases of generative AI and synthetic media. Today, I'm joined by three great panelists, Stuart, Bowden, Lujain Ibrahim, and Antony Cousins. Just going to do a quick intro to the panelists, ask questions, and then open it up for everyone to ask your own questions about this topic. I'm going to start with Antony. Antony is the CEO of Factmata. Factmata uses AI to combat misinformation and disinformation, fake news, and other forms of online harm. For the last 10 years, Antony has focused on using his technology and communications experience in leadership roles at different AI startups. Stuart leads the global strategy and product teams at Wavemaker, one of the world's most successful media and communications planning companies. At the Oxford Internet Institute, he'll be researching the ways that Web3 technologies and communities alter how consumers and citizens make decisions and use artifacts to display status and membership. And finally, Mounir is the Vice President of Public Affairs and Impact at Truepic, an award-winning technology company specializing in digital content provenance and authenticity. Mounir has previously served as a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State and is a key Syria advisor to various ambassadors and presidential cabinet members. Thanks again, Stuart, Mounir, and Antony for joining us. I'm going to kick it off with the first big question. People, as these different technological changes are experiencing generative AI happen, we're drawing parallels between the current climate in AI and the 2021 Web3 climate, where the transformative potential of the different technologies in question was almost seen as self-evident and like matter of fact. So I wanted to ask you, after filtering out all the hype, what tangible opportunities or benefits do you see generative AI bringing to your industry or field, or other industries and fields that you've been observing over the years?
Shall I go first? It's the nearest the question asking. So public relations, communications is largely a text-based field. There's a lot about human relationships in there as well, and I'm going to come back to the human relationship part. But a lot of what we produce is text. And I think that's, for me, the biggest difference we've seen since the Web3 and before. I've been in AI since 2014, where we were just saying when it was really hard to get really anything useful from it. But the ability now for anybody, not technical skills aside, anybody to be able to generate text and be able to do that quicker and faster than they did before. And for people who may have had difficulties creating text, right? If they had difficulties writing or difficulties typing, the inclusive nature of the ability to generate good quality text now is a massive time saver. And I think that's the way I look at it. It's the calculator kind of reference. It is a massive time saver for people to generate good quality text. And in our field, that's huge. Not just on the hacks, but on the black side as well, the journalists and for the PRs.
And I think from a creative services perspective, the WPP is a creative services business. I think I'd agree that every single layer of our business is likely to be affected. I think it's very easy for us to go to the core product that we produce, advertising materials, and immediately understand how synthetic media, generative AI technologies are going to alter how we organise our business and the decisions we need to make about the materials that we're producing for clients. But every decision, I think, inside our business, and almost everybody who works in the 110,000 people or so who work inside the WPP business are tasked with in some way synthesizing information, reorganizing information, iterating on previous work, developing new strategies and communicating those things as clearly as possible. So I think from SEO optimization through to strategic planning for clients, right the way through to our creative development processes, it's extremely likely that we're going to see not only severe disruption, but I think fundamental changes in the product that we're making and the way that advertising actually plays a role for businesses and in society, because it will create very many different options that we haven't previously had available.
Yeah, I would double down on everything that was said already. The vast nature of this technology applies quite literally almost any industry on earth. Of course, there's the PR and the communications. You're seeing the natural language processors and the chat GPT is really being used there. The creative side, look at all the synthetic images and videos that are being used, how it's many say will supplement, even replace a lot of graphic designers in the world. How small businesses can create advanced imagery for marketing, for sales, for any sort of external communication, but then go deeper. There are synthetic generation of code that literally can write code that currently software engineers write. There is synthetic 3D renderings that maybe architects would be developing. In the medical biodata creation space, you can run models to create data and then actually test and run medical trials on that data. So the uses are actually quite tangible and endless, and I think that is one of the, I would say, differences than a lot of the Web3 conversations we heard 12 months ago. So maybe 12 months from now, they remember that guy who said, I do think this is actually quite tangible and different.
And I think the fact that it's immediately democratized, that you don't have to go through an organizational structure, there's no power hierarchy about who's going to make a business case, how does this get to engineering, how does this go through all the many filters that just slow down change inside our business. Literally everybody who cares to have a go is now able to get halfway into identifying a kind of code base for this work, is able to create their own materials. So suddenly in our business, everybody is released from their departments. And that's going to cause some really, really interesting mayhem because we're used to having a creative department and an art department and a studio department and a data department. I think it will really unleash some really complicated but powerful creativity, which will not just disrupt what we do, but will actually change our own business extremely fundamentally, surprisingly quickly.
In your industry, the same as our industry, the point I was making about human relationships is that we've talked a lot about kind of the technical outputs of image generation or text generation, but actually that's an opportunity cost right now. You have to spend human time and human creativity creating that kind of content. Whereas actually, if you can get AI to generate that kind of content for you, you've got more time to do the human things. You've got more time to do the actual human relationships, understanding the needs, the strategic insight. You've got more time to do those things which actually add value. So I think it's not just about the ability of generative AI to kind of create that content, it's what you can do instead of having to spend that time doing it. I think that's going to be huge for your industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And the amount of quality brain power in our business, which is going on making minor changes to headlines for social or reiterating a slightly different radio ad for a dealer in a different part of America in the automotive industry. The really quality, super expensive intellect making changes which are significantly better delivered in very user-friendly technology, like the ones we're talking about this afternoon, is going to be remarkable. We're talking about tens and tens of thousands of jobs just in our company, which can be directed to far more kind of powerful and interesting tasks.
Yeah, and I think the three of you kind of alluded to this, the difference maybe between disruption and transformation in this case, especially Stuart, I think you use the word disruption a lot. I'm curious if you do see like a clear distinction here between transformative potential of generative AI and disruptive potential. An example, I guess, is there's a lot of buzz on how it's going to disrupt education specifically. I'm sure a lot of people have heard, plagiarism and cheating in essays. I'm sure a lot of people maybe at Oxford have written essays of ChatGPT. I'm curious if you see clear industries where there can be disruption that maybe has more of a negative connotation, let's say, than a transformation, or if you do see like a clear distinction between the two.
Well, we were having a discussion about kind of the journalism angles upstairs before this, which is really, really risky. That on the positive angle, you've got journalists in the same way can now create content on things like, I saw the examples of housing stories. So every local paper is writing stories about local house prices because everyone in that area has a relatively interesting kind of look at those house prices once in a while. But that is the most boring content for a journalist to create, and it's expensive, and they need to be focusing on more journalistic, investigative, quality stuff. So you've got the benefits for journalists in terms of time saving. You've also got the risks for journalists, which is that now you've got the ability for people to create fake content and misinformation at scale, industrial scale, and disseminate that at scale. So the time now for journalists to spend more time checking their content, checking their facts, that's going to increase. But I think the point I make is I think you could look at that completely negatively, which is, yes, they definitely have to spend more time looking at the facts, but the positive angles only come if they lean into it. So they're going to have the negatives they have to get the positives in order to balance out their time. So I think for me it's, and I'm biased aside, I've been working in AI since 2014. I'm definitely pro. So to get that bias out there when I'm answering my questions so everyone kind of understands my bias, which is important, right?
Yeah, I haven't been working on AI since 2014. But it's so I'm definitely not pro in that. But I do think that your question about, yes, it will disrupt our industry. I think it will obviously disrupt many industries, particularly information industries and white collar professional industries are going to find themselves turned inside out. But I think it will also just it will transform the nature of what it is the industry does. And from an advertising perspective, we spent 100 years creating a single creative asset, a TV ad or a vehicle that we try and place somewhere, and you either like that or you don't, but that's the ad that we've made. I think the idea that with a combination of these technologies, we're able to move much more convincingly, not into more kind of conversational, relationship-based dialogues with different, sometimes individual customers at scale is really interesting. We're doing some work in the UK for the Royal Navy, where we've moved from making ads about how exciting it is to be in the Navy. You should join up, and it's great, and you get a gun, and it's kind of super exciting. Creating that desire and that intent to building more kind of conversational AIs, which we're now turning into more kind of synthetic human-fronted relationships, because we know it takes a year before you join there. You don't wake up one day and decide you're going to do it. You have questions. You want to spend time exploring what that's going to mean for you. It's a dialogue. But advertising couldn't previously solve that problem. But now, obviously now a combination of synthetic humans and conversational AI means you can stay in that informed dialogue over time. And when I think about the range of clients and the work we do, people will stop making so much advertising because there are many, many more powerful ways now to persuade and accompany and support people through to the decisions that you want them to make. So I think it will be highly disruptive.
So on the disruption side, I'll state my bias as well. I'm a little bit on the other side. I wouldn't label it as pro or anti. I think it is a mere fact. Generative AI is here, it's here to stay, and it's going to be used. So being pro or anti, I don't think really matters. But from a disruption standpoint, our company, Truepic, we specialize in image authenticity and transparency. My colleague Martin here, he works with Fortune 500 companies every day who automate their processes using our technology because it is authenticity. It helps them run their automation, their entire workflow, because they can trust the inherent digital content they're getting. Let's take insurance as an example. In the United States at least, I assume in Europe as well, it is the age-old problem. You get into a fender bender as you're driving at the supermarket, you call your insurance company, they say, oh, horrible, we're gonna send an insurance adjuster out to your location between this time and this time and this day. That was the old way of doing it. A new phenomenon has been taking place across the insurance industry and many industries, and that's digital transformation. This was starting before COVID-19. COVID-19 was an accelerant. Nearly every industry on earth has digitally transformed by whether they like it or not during COVID. So now, businesses, banking, real estate, property management, insurance, and many others rely on digital content. At the same time, we're seeing the growth of generative AI that can produce completely synthetic digital content. You see there's a little bit of a problem there. How does an insurance company know when they're getting thousands of claims a day and paying out millions a day, know if that content is actually authentic or synthetic? This becomes a significant problem, and I would argue that Gen AI is actually going to be disrupting the last disruptor, which was digital transformation, which companies are still going through right now. So where I think this lands, and I think Antony mentioned it, there will need to be transparency in digital content. And that's how you mitigate the disruption. Where a company knows, that was made by Dale. Okay, that was made by Stability AI. That was made by ChatGPT, or that would be text. That is, I think, a nuanced difference that will have to take place. Otherwise, massive industries will feel serious disruption.
Yeah. And I think that idea of transparency and system and consumer visibility about what's going on behind the screen is going to be a significant obviously legal, policy and ethical challenge for us. And I think we've just about got our heads around how to work with social media and influencers, and how are we clear what's really being paid for and what someone is really promoting. Our feeds are full of all of these, up until at least last year, promoting various types of crypto coins. But I think the sense that we're using generative AI to make personalised creative treatments for individuals, perhaps reflecting back what we know about you. Are we changing the age or the ethnicity or the accent of the person who's talking to you in the ad using data that we either own or have built into how we've created that work? Is that something we have to disclose? Is that altering our relationship with that customer? Di Mace is here, who's head of data and AI, and her team did some very interesting work in trying to understand what consumers' responses were to having images modified in advertising to reflect their own age and ethnicity. And people do prefer them. People want to be sold to by people who look and feel and sound and behave like in the way that they do. I know perhaps we should have to disclose that, but it'll be quite a challenge for us to get our heads around what is reasonable claim and what is manipulation, as we can change more and more of what we're displaying to people.
Yeah. While we're on the point of disrupting sort of the mitigating the negative aspects of disruption, I'm curious if you could elaborate some more on what you think the biggest roadblocks to the safe and effective adoption of these technologies are, and whether you think these roadblocks will create some type of gap between development and adoption.
I'll go first every time.
I'm happy to start. And they're the real experts, so I'll yield the rest of my time. But I really do think it's transparency and responsible disclosure. When when generative systems are creating synthetic content, we believe, and I personally believe, the content consumer not only should know, has a right to know that this was made by X computer system. There's different ways it could be disclosed, there's different ways in which it can look, the UX can change, but fundamentally, when we can get that down in a unified open standard in which it looks and feels the same way, it's much like an SSL padlock we have on almost every URL now on every browser. Once we get to that level, I think the sky is the limit. Without that, I see that as I personally see that as a major block. Even if it's not coming from consumers, it will start coming from governments and legislators at the state, federal, or nation state level.
Yeah, I think understanding what the legal framework of this is going to be is going to be a major drag for us, because obviously I can imagine people in our industry are going to want to start creating advertising materials sourced through all the platforms that we use every day. But knowing that might, there's a difference between messing around with Stable Diffusion yourself and then making making an ad out there and then finding yourself as the first business that's going to get sued and the first client that's going to get sued for doing that. So there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm and energy. I think at some point inside our organisation in the industry, it's going to collide with that sense of reality until there's more certainty about what's possible. And obviously we've seen Getty and others start to explore their legal avenues for materials being scraped and reprocessed and used in that way. We're as an industry, we've got a reasonable risk appetite, but I don't know whether it would stretch as far as us making a Super Bowl ad, unless we knew exactly which materials we'd been reconstituting.
And I'd add to those points, I want to come back to the regulatory point, which is a really interesting one. But I think for me, there's still a perception problem, which is we've had decades and decades of fiction and media, which is programmed society to be scared of AI. Terminator is still in your minds. When I mention AI, I guarantee you half the people in this room have the picture of the robot with the red eyes. Guaranteed.
We're older. I don't know that.
So I was giving this talk at Holt Business School, so MBA students, early 20s, so the start of their careers. And I gauged the room in terms of AI for those guys and said, I'm here to talk about AI. Can you tell me, hands up, if you're thinking positively about it, hands up if you're thinking negatively about it? It was about split 50-50. 50-50 between the people who had grown up and seen those kinds of films, and the Terminator is an old school reference, but it's every year there's a new Terminator film to reinforce that bias. But the other 50% of the people were really leaning into it in a positive way, thinking, okay, so AI is going to happen anyway, and they're picking jobs and picking careers. They're fairly confident isn't going to get automated completely. But in some of the other cases, picking careers because they want to work with AI, they think they're relatively technical, they think that gives them an edge in terms of engaging and using technology in their jobs. So actually, just over 50% of the course were super excited to be working with AI and thinking, honestly, positively about how they work with it. Unfortunately, for everyone's kind of in the workforce right now, especially people of our age, I think there's a perception that if they don't engage with it, then they're not going to lose their jobs to it. So I think there's still a risk of engaging. Like, if I use it and I get really good at it, then all of a sudden I can be really quick at doing my job, and then all of a sudden they don't need me to do as much work. So I think there's still that perception risk. Whereas at the point I always make, and the point I come back to, is that it's not about doing less work, it's about doing more of the work that makes you human. More of the work that only you, the human, can do. And that's the way I think we should be thinking about it. So I think it's a perception risk, but also the perception comes back to the regulatory framework, which is, I think people feel there is a risk because they feel it isn't so controlled. There isn't an obvious kind of regulatory framework in place. People aren't aware of the laws that are in place for it. And by and large, the regulatory framework for AI is broken down in different industries. So my first AI startup was in kind of HR tech. And AI in use of HR and choosing jobs and reading CVs and recommending people, there is regulation in place as part of GDPR to protect people from that. But I think people aren't so aware of that, and therefore it kind of scares them. It feels like it's uncontrolled. It feels like the AI is in charge. It feels like it's being run by tech people, not necessarily governments and normal business people, and they don't necessarily trust the tech people. So I think there's a regulatory framework that needs to come into existence, but it is, for us in AI, and for anyone here contributing to the development of AI, I think it's in our gift to make sure that that regulatory framework, when it comes into force, not just in the UK but across the world, that regulatory framework actually supports the effective use of AI and doesn't constrain it. But that relies on us, people like yourselves also, behaving responsibly and not taking advantage. And we need to think about it for ourselves, or else we will feel the heavy hand of regulatory involvement later on in the line.
One thing I would double click on is, while I agree with everything that was said, these are all obstacles. I would predict, though, it's not necessarily going to slow the growth. This is such powerful technology. I do believe it is a watershed type breakthrough or invention, although I know you've been working on it for, you're like, it's not a breakthrough, but nonetheless, to the masses,
Yes.
This is all new. And I think it is so powerful that it's going to be messy, in that I don't think people will not use it, not touch it until these items are ironed out. It is so useful for so many reasons that it's going to start being, the adoption is going to be through the roof.
Yeah. That's the case of ChatGPT, right? The difference between that and every technology before it is you need no technical skill whatsoever. It's so easy to use, and it's crossed the barrier.
It's really weird. It feels like we're at every stage of the Gartner hype cycle simultaneously. There's massive excitement. We're in the slough of despair. It really has accelerated that timeline, kind of really strangely. And much like you, we have quite a lot of conversations internally about how should people orientate themselves against this technology to stay in their career and to be able to grow their career. And people are buying ebooks on the best prompts you can write to try and do. People are trying to engage with it as best they can. But I think we step back and look at all the uncertainty that's still in this space. I think the one thing that is clear is that it's going to create a massive demand for choicefulness. Just the volume of options and things you can create now so quickly kind of breaks the supply chain dynamic that constrained our business. You could write one script at a time, and then you'd storyboard it, and then perhaps you'd do an animatronic to have a look at it, and then you'd think about what if this director did it versus a different director did it, and it would take months. But you only had the one thing that you could sell because the machine could only make one thing. I have so many variants now, and I can change them simultaneously. I think that human control and decision making and the confidence to make that decision will ultimately become a far more important power than necessarily the ability to write a good prompt. How do we deal with superabundance? Is it something we haven't had to deal with before in most industries? We've been constrained by supply. There's now unlimited supply, and that's going to need to be managed really, really mindfully, I think.
So there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot to deal with. Technology is really powerful, it's not going anywhere, and the regulatory framework is not mature enough to sort of govern it as well as maybe people wanting to be governed. I guess in the meantime, as we get to that mature regulatory framework, a lot of institutions have different roles to play. You touched on the role of the media journalism, managing expectations, and covering AI responsibly. What other main institutions do you think should be preparing people for this powerful technology as it matures and as sort of regulation needs to see how we interact with it and what are different implications and new things that we learn that come up?
Well, I think industry bodies, so there's plenty of industry bodies in PR and communications, but all the industry bodies, I think, need to take a role in. I think for me, it's about individual companies are looking very much for themselves. Like, how do we take advantage of this? How are our competitors taking advantage? How do we compete against our competitors? But as an industry, and I think this is one of the primary ways to influence the regulatory framework, industries need to come together and go, what is the most ethical? What is the appropriate use of AI in this industry? WP is a massive company in your industry, but talking to other people in that industry, getting them together, getting to agree consistently what it is, I think we're taking a lot of the pressure out of the regulatory framework. Otherwise, the government is going to fill that gap, right? If the industries don't come together and agree what it is, and we have bad actors, we have people pushing that boundary, and we have bad consequences, that's when the government is going to fill that gap with heavy-handed regulation. So I think for me, it's the industry bodies and the industry itself, one of the bigger players.
Yeah, and I think it'd be really interesting to see whether people can get themselves together to try and make to try and speak with a single voice in this area. It's kind of complicated for trade bodies with competing interests, competing stakeholders to be able to make headway in this. But it's I think from our point of view, we'll be relying on the Advertising Association and other trade bodies to try and help us input to government discussions appropriately in this area, because I think otherwise we'll be regulated, very, possibly quite aggressively from people trying to defend against harms which are not yet evident, and that really will be a restriction on our ability to exploit the potential here. If people try to curtail it before we even reach a potential harm.
I would, of course, double click on industry bodies. I would say those deploying the Gen AI tech need to themselves become the first movers of best practices. Even if they are somehow exploratory, but as adding transparency and disclosure as a best practice, even if no one is forcing you to do that, nobody is telling you to do that, I think that needs both. I'd also say government plays a role. No, I do not actually believe that, Wild West legislation on everything is the right one. Not at all. I think you need to take time and study, but what they can do is massive education programs for public, to explain what this is, to think twice before you see digital content, and really put in place at a curriculum level, even at younger ages, the idea of an explanation of this technology, because media literacy is going to be a huge, probably the most important aspect of mitigating the downside effects. So there's a lot of areas that stop short of, just outright legislation that can be done from a variety of parts.
Digital media literacy is 100%. I think the biggest challenge we actually have right now, I think, is that kids that have grown up with access to social media and internet are actually a lot more prepared, a lot more aware than actually people of sort of our age-ish. So I think we grew up in kind of the golden age, not many people really remember these days, but when we grew up and internet was a brand new thing, it was the most amazing place, full of free information, people kind of sharing information and knowledge. It was a golden era of the internet, kind of the mid-late 90s, early 2000s, up until the point social media came into place. And not just when social media first came out, because when Twitter first came out, it was the most amazing place for people to actually share and communicate across the world, which wasn't really possible before. But then, as those social media platforms became monetized, as they realized they had to monetize to survive, the tools that were released to support that were then hijacked and abused by people for nefarious purposes. We've seen that over the last 10 years get worse. But that golden era, I think, has left people with a vulnerability where that was their experience of the internet for many, many years. And those people now have a kind of a safety gap. They're the people who, talking about my nan who gets the ad on the computer, click this because you've got a virus, she'll click that, and we have that whole generation of people doing that with the internet right now. Whereas I think children, and we still have to invest more, but I think there's a kind of a younger age of people coming through who generally have more inbuilt protections. But we have that vulnerable adult audience. These are the people who I think, if you look at the kind of spread of engagement, misinformation, disinformation, they're the ones engaging with it because they didn't have that protection built in.
No, please.
I think it'll be interesting to see to what extent we can get enough of a shared perspective to make progress in this area, because I think we will find quite a lot of conflicting mayhem in this area between some of the major players. I mean, you're going to see Microsoft and Google, are going to try and kill each other about what this could potentially do for their business models. They're unlikely to have the same perspective on exactly how we're going to, how we should approach this and what the limitations could be. They have very different business requirements from this in the future. I think, before you thinking that I think we'll be able to get government and education bodies sufficiently aligned with this. It took years and years and years for us to get some basic, internet harms training in schools. The machine moves so slowly, and it can do one thing at a time, and by the time it's done that thing, it's already overtaken. I think it will be really. I think we are entering an era where the pace is going to accelerate so quickly again that I'm not quite sure how we think about legislation in this area, or how we really think about just absorbing the amount of information that we need to be able to have a perspective, let alone get the industry around the table easily to be able to do this, because vested interests are going to be, I think, perhaps not easily aligned.
So I would respectfully disagree with the point on children or younger generations. You are right that they are far more internet savvy than certainly we were, but there's a stat out there, and I might botch it, so paraphrase me, but I think it's something like 40% of people under 20 in the United States, at least, use TikTok as their main search engine. Think about that. 40%. That is their main source of information. That is highly concerning to me. The over-reliance on social media without actually having significant media literacy skills to maybe they're vetting every piece of information they see on TikTok, but I'm going to go on a limb and say that's probably not the case. So that is a concerning trend. The over-reliance on social media platforms, for all the reasons you laid out, have monetization and user stickiness goals that they adhere to with this influx of synthetic content. So that is an area that concerns me.
Yeah, and that is a really interesting example, because we've had a number of years to come to terms with the fact that potentially that there are some harms generated by social media and the algorithms that kind of drive that. But there's still no real progress to us having access to what TikTok's passive algorithm structure is that's helping us serve that. There's no visibility on the ad that tells you how you've selected that. And it's interesting seeing in Twitter, as they start to break out for you and following, you suddenly start to surface some of these things that have been hidden in how content is selected for you. But if over that period of time, with the government focusing in on potential social harms, we still can't surface or see that, I think the idea that we'll start to surface and see where is this information being gathered from in a synthetic media format feels quite a distance away. I'm not sure we've got to first base on trying to solve this question yet.
Right. Definitely. I think the issue of platform transparency is a big one, but there's also the issue of people, like me, like at different research institutions are doing a lot of research on this, but there's also a gap between what the public receives and whether this research is made as publicly accessible or even publicly legible by average people. This research is done, but it's still siloed in academic institutions.
Yeah. And do people really want to
And do people really wanna know?
engage to that
Yeah.
extent? I mean, even if you put the slightest barrier up, you want to go to mass, you want to go to federated servers, you want to control your access to this information.
Right.
That isn't how people, they want to hit the button, they've got 4 minutes, they want to watch it, they want to get out. They don't want to architect their own experience and necessarily control their own barriers in the way that sometimes we think they want to, even if they're aware of the trade-offs.
Absolutely.
They're trade-offs that they are willing to make for convenience, and I think we shouldn't over-endow them with an active desire to manage their lives
Absolutely.
intellectually and pragmatically in that way.
It might be impractical, maybe too much to ask for even for that person.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly too much to ask for me, but
Yeah.
I won't
For sure. Okay, on that note, I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A. If you have a question, raise your hand, and then we'll see how to do this. Start from you in the front.
Yeah, you mentioned at some point that there must be a focus on what the human can, the capacity that these machines are giving you is not a way to get out of your job, but rather to focus on what the human. And you describe some values and concepts that you're thinking when you're saying what the human should focus on, what's like some sort of principles that are guiding that.
Yeah, so the best example I can provide is if you think about a plane, right? So on a plane you've got pilots and you've got kind of the air stewards who help the passengers. Right now we're comfortable with the pilot, knowing the pilot is sat there, we've got a human ready to control the plane in case something goes wrong, knowing full well the human in that pilot seat does very, very little really. And it won't be long before we have AIs flying those planes, right? Because once a pilot is replaced with an AI, because the AI can land and take off, then we don't really need the pilot. It's a binary kind of success measure. Can you take off and land the plane safely? However, the air steward looking after the passengers, that is where you need human relationships. And that can be supported by AI. AI, just throwing this out there, I'm not going to invent a new startup for it, but looking at the passengers, looking at their kind of facial recognition, working out whether they're happy or not, working out which passengers might need more support or unhappy with flying. That's the kind of thing where AI can support, but you need the human in that relationship because it's the human is the perception of value by the customer, whereas the customer doesn't really care whether there's a pilot sat in the seat as long as the plane is safe. So I think that for me is the delineation between what is a role that can be enhanced by AI but would always be better with a human and one that would be replaceable by an AI.
So you would say like this communal relationship values, sort of, basically like having a feedback, having a pleasurable experience rather than someone is taking care of you.
Well, humans are going to become the most expensive part in any process as AI automates more. So I think the perception of the value of a human itself is part of the process. So where you've got the steward, you recognise there's a steward there to support you, and until the point where we've got one steward per person on a plane, right? There's not much more we can do. But the use of a human, that itself is going to be the thing that demonstrates the value. That's the relationship.
That's interesting, isn't it? I think trying to work out in what aspects having a visible human mind or a visible human creative relationship is valuable will end up being kind of quite a complicated judgment. I mean, I'm not sure if we would it make any difference to know that the latest MCU movie was made by a computer, was kind of algorithmically derived and composited back together. Do you have any expectation that movie really has a driving creative intelligence behind it, or are you quite happy if it just keeps serving you, here's the next Thor movie, here's the next X movie, we brought all these other characters in and we've rebuilt it? I'm not sure that diminishes my understanding of the quality of that experience, but right, there will be places and times when you absolutely demand to know that this is, or you attribute value because you understand that a human mind has somehow tried to represent their interpretation of reality in some way, but it's that may be a smaller pool of experiences and a smaller volume of creative material than perhaps we imagine it to be.
Can we take another question? So many questions.
Okay, no.
Yeah.
My name is Chris Graff. I work for the large science publisher, the research publisher Springer Nature. And my question is about that sort of thing. You talked a lot about generating content for consumer audiences, and my content is for researchers, I guess. And as it becomes more and more open, perhaps it's for everybody. And so my question is about about bad actors using generative AI to fake science, and I wonder whether you thought at all about that, and if you have, I'd love to hear what this is.
Maybe more in your area.
Sadly, I have thought of that. I'm not the cynical person that thinks of every bad, but it is true. I'd be lying to you if I knew the exact solution. The only comfort I have on that, usually, let's pretend there is a bad actor that is applying for FDA approval of some medical use. There is usually a thorough review process through multiple clinical trials, so it would be a little more difficult to pass off that data, but that is certainly a possibility, can it be? And even if with transparency, I don't know how you stop that unless you do not allow data creation through synthetic or generative AI. So it's an interesting question that I don't have an answer, but it's certainly something I've thought of. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
People in the back.
Lovely, thank you. Angie French, Meta, so I don't need to explain what we do, as you've covered that with varying degrees of accuracy. But I just would like to ask you a question. So, Stuart, you painted a picture around this kind of utopia around generative AI, people using ChatGPT. Actually, Amazon have come out this week and said that they want to limit the use of ChatGPT, as every input stream is a learning moment for it, and they're seeing intellectual property surface actually through ChatGPT now. So how do you balance this utopia, the picture that you paint, and that corporate governance and protecting the intellectual property of your business?
Yeah, that's a great question, to which I don't even really have the beginnings of a proper answer, other than to say I think questions around IP. I think there's another panel on IP this afternoon, I think, or I would query whether our understanding of that term is going to be sufficiently strong to endure, even at a basic level, trying to understand where the ownership and the value creation exists in some of these supply chains is going to be interesting. Inside our business, that's obviously a risk for us because it's been extremely transparent who owns what aspect of it. If you press the shutter on the camera, it's pretty clear what rights you own in the ongoing value chain that sits inside that.
I was going to say, my question is less about the IP and more about our intellectual property as organisations is leaking into ChatGPT every single day as our staff use it.
Yeah.
So how do we kind of think about the governance of that actually every single day? Because we're all signing up and we're all using it and we're teaching it all about our business. Actually.
Sure. We have that problem with Meta and other platforms as well. I mean, there are things that we do that enhance your information.
Okay, I open myself up for that.
I was going to say,
You guys, I kind of understand the question, but we all live in a relatively pragmatic world, and I guess if I was a publisher, I'd be having real concerns about what aspects of my content I wanted scraped and then distributed. If it didn't have a link and a commercial return path through search back to my business, then I'm going to have a real problem with that. I'm probably not very happy with the current setup, and I'm going to have a real problem with that future that you're painting. And the digital value chain is murky enough and grey enough as it already exists. I think this is going to be problematic, but publishers are relatively slow to respond to this. I think organisations, Amazon accepted, are probably not going to be in a position to make really strong, decisive business-changing calls on some of this stuff yet, even if they have the capacity and the advice to be able to do that.
I also think it's sort of ironic that Amazon is complaining about it, given they've got Alexa listening to basically every single conversation happening on the planet. But I think that you're right also that individuals using it, it's going to be very difficult for Amazon to stop everybody completely using that to like wholesale. But also I think we might be focusing too much on ChatGPT. It's just one example of generative AI. And if you fast forward 2, 3, 4 years, ChatGPT may not even be the best or the only game in town. So I think it's a trade-off between the benefits you get in productivity versus the risk that, you're right, it's going to leak into that. But there's going to be other people, and there'll be no doubt on-premise versions of ChatGPT coming in the future.
I would add one other potential scenario. At least I see a world, at least with artists and content creators, in which they are creating art and signing it immutably with some sort of attribution, and then that is feeding a Gen AI model, and that seed of the Gen AI model then goes on and other people are creating based off of that, and you could potentially track that back and remunerate the original content creator. There could be a world in which attribution actually helps content creators, and then that could feed models. I don't know how that would work with ChatGPT, but I can see that working with images and videos.
Yeah, there have been conversations about how you could organise that by doing, by effectively doing more traditional search and then using the outcome of that search to train large language models that say that there's the ability to try and reattribute value and money back to the original source producers of the material, but that obviously requires us to go through either some authentication procedure or some way for us to capture and limit the source contributors to those models themselves, and this is going to keep everybody busy for a long time to come, isn't it?
Okay, let's take another question.
Yeah, just it's interesting that you all sort of speak about transparency, and I'm sort of wondering, I see AI as potentially one of the biggest threats to human life alongside climate change, and I think Patagonia have done an incredible job, and if we're sort of talking about that publicly, and you can see how well it's served them as a company, and if this is like the 1970s to climate change and we're all not looking up and not listening to AI alignment researchers, are you guys talking to the public about your sort of like ads that you might be running that maybe like starting to look at Minority Report and creating a public dialogue there and sort of basically sort of using social responsibility and moving it into a digital space and using that to actually stand out from the competition and differentiate yourself?
I think we inevitably will have to do that. I mean, it's a conversation that is still only starting, and I think we're only beginning to trial some of the technology that you're talking about, let alone taking it out to the market in a real way. But the brands who fund this work are ultimately the people whose kind of reputational impact is at stake. It'd be disastrous for WPP for us to be involved in that. It'd be catastrophic for a brand to find itself in a position where people believe that they've been willingly misled or manipulated by misuse of the data, in the way that we've engaged with them. So I don't know what format that will take, or what type of public consultation will be required, whether that's adequately covered by how DCMS or other kind of governmental bodies will approach it, or industry bodies will approach it. But at some point, the voice of the system is going to have to be heard in this discussion. Whether they will care enough to contribute, or whether they will be informed enough en masse to be able to contribute to this, I kind of doubt. But there'll have to be some dialogue. I don't think this can arrive without people having a point of view on it.
So we're more of a business-to-business style play, but it's absolutely part of our intention to talk to all the businesses and stakeholders in the market to understand what the interests are and the concerns are. But also coming to this kind of event, absolutely, and happy to talk to you after. Actually, I want to hear more.
All right, another question.
So Conrad from the Advertising Association. So what I'm gathering is the general assumption, the consensus that in the future we're going to have a lot more content being created by generative AI. The question comes down is how do we deal with the epistemological challenge with this? In the sense that if we're getting a lot more of this content which probably scrapes other content which is also being created by AI, at what point do we then have a problem of what is knowledge and how we know whether that knowledge is true?
I'd give a quick answer to that before you've probably got more detailed thoughts, but I just want to clarify one thing: drafted by AI. So I think the recommended, or what we recommend people use AI for, is for the drafting process. You as a human are still responsible for what you send out into the world. So whilst you might use AI to generate text or images, at the end of the day, it's still you reviewing that. You still need to have a view on what is good and what is not, what is useful and what is not. You need to take responsibility for what you're putting out. So if you're using AI to generate something and you're automating the distribution of that to the world, that's irresponsible. And the AI that we've got right now doesn't, I think, in most use cases, qualify for good enough to do that.
Sometimes you get into a situation where that actually shapes your worldview. So there's an interesting corollary, particularly with, say, for instance, like currency trading. And if you understand and read all the rules about, what's the buy signal, what's the sell signal, when you think about it, why should any of these signals be true? But because the market, the herd, believes that to be true, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I agree that the risk is that generative AI is trained on all the content it's available for. Right? And when a greater proportion of that content is itself created by generative AI, which we're a long way from, right? We've got over many hundreds of years actually of kind of written content for the generative to be trained on. It's going to take a long while for us to catch up with that amount of content. But yeah, that is a risk. But at the end of the day, the human is the failsafe. And even as an AI proponent, I'm not a proponent for AI being set loose on the world to create and distribute and engage in conversations. You as the human still need to take responsibility. And you as a human still need to ask the right questions, right? I think prompt engineering is going to be the skill of 2023, if definitely the skill of 2024. You still need to know what questions to ask. You still need to set the direction, because AI isn't spontaneous, right? And AI isn't going to sit there and create an event like this. It's taking humans to think this is a conversation that needs to be had and to create it. The AI will respond to your prompts and give you the content, but you need to set the right prompts and you need to be the judge of what it creates. So at the moment we're talking about an automation of the process in the middle. But you're right that there is a risk that if you're lazy, and as maybe a decade or two from now, there is a risk that we sort of atrophy our creative processes, that we start to rely a lot more on AI, and that becomes a challenge.
I would, no surprise, I do share the concern there. We were talking about this earlier. I agree with everything Anthony said for good actors, absolutely. But what about the bad actors? Now you don't need millions and millions of bad actors. The speed and velocity in which information travels around this world, right now you can click and people around the world are going to be reading that and seeing that. Furthermore, you can automate all of this. So now you can have generative AI systems producing fake news articles and then having bots pushing that out over and over. Let's take a real life example. Let's look at Ukraine. There could be the Bucha massacre. You could have just as easily created 500 articles saying it's actually not true. We have on-the-ground reporting coming from Ukraine, and you can push that out. That creates a scenario known as the liar's dividend. That is the fear. The liar's dividend is because the inability to verify and authenticate digital content consumers reach to apathy and say nothing is true. That gives bad actors the ability to undermine all digital content, and that's the loss of knowledge, I think, that you're pointing to. So I do share that as a concern.
Can I do a follow-up question on this?
Yeah, I think we'll take one last quick question.
There's one in here.
Yes.
Well, maybe it's me.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
It's-
We've got time.
They both have time.
Just one quick
Rock,
question.
paper, scissors.
I don't think this is like a quick question, but I think it's more of an open discussion. So when we evaluate AI values, right now we see AI as like a time-saving, cost-saving measure. But when it comes to creativity works, it's difficult to evaluate how because creativity work, the output is not a quantitative. We can't use a quantitative measurement to evaluate the value. So how do we? What do you think in the future in terms of AI-generated creativity versus human-generated creativity? How do we evaluate the value in the future?
Yeah. That is quite a deep question.
Yeah.
I'm an entirely non-kind of philosophical sector. I would partly query whether in the majority of instances that massively matters. The majority of creative content that anyone absorbs in any format you're not necessarily trying to pass or understand necessarily the human mind that created it, or you're not trying to interpret that human's relationship with the world that led to it. It's your own relationship to the content, which is the valuable part of that exchange. How are you responding to the creative yourself? And that needn't necessarily change. That doesn't require a human on the other side of the creation process always. I'm not quite sure how we, what the taxonomy or what the division status is of things which are human created to be human understood, as opposed to things which just exist or which are created and human understood. But I imagine people will become slightly more skilled and adept at trying to work out, should they be trying to interpret human meaning behind this thing, or are they just happy with their own associations with the creative that they're engaging with?
Can I follow up just quickly? Do you see generative AI become the next entertainment for human beings?
Yes. Well, I mean, sorry, that's but if you look at the majority of content that is, a lot of the content is consumed on streaming services. We look after Netflix and Paramount for example. There's a lot of what's going through. There were, obviously there's a degree of AI selection and content selection which goes into those systems, and I'm not sure it matters very much whether there's another series of Rick and Morty that's created by AI. I just want another series of that. That doesn't necessarily. It's possible. It's possible that will happen. It's possible that I will be in that show. I mean, you think into future iterations about how is this movie tailored for or around me? How does Green Booth start to move into video? There are different entertainment formats which don't exist yet, which will be obviously created more on the fly and available. And my relationship with it is different. The value I get from it is because it's been created for me, or involves me, or has responded to my needs, rather than the creative sense of an individual has created this for me to enjoy.
All right, I might have to wrap up, but thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists. There's